Babylon, the formidable jewel of the ancient world, fell without a single door being kicked in. We're taught that building empires always required centuries of sheer carnage, but Persia flipped the script, swallowing 3 continents in a mere 132 months. The world didn't wake up to the sound of trumpets or skies ablaze. The math of this expansion didn't rely on the edge of a sword, completely shattering the bread and butter of classical imperialism. The Persian war machine assimilated dozens of nations with such surgical precision that the victims only realized they had been conquered when the loose change in their pockets already bore the face of a foreign king. But there was a detail that was even more terrifying. In 539 BC, the bronze gates of the Babylonian capital, widely considered an impenetrable vault in the ancient world, weren't battered down. They were unlocked from the inside. There was no grueling, drawn-out siege like the ones we're used to seeing in textbooks, nor the bloodbath that was the standard playbook of great conquests. King Cyrus the Great marched through the streets not with the arrogance of a tyrant stepping on the defeated, but welcomed as an anointed liberator who made it a point to offer tributes to the gods of the very people he had just vanquished. And this wasn't just a PR stunt, it was the reflection of unparalleled tactical genius. The Persian high command realized the fatal flaw that sank the empires before them. Decimating populations, enslaving kingdoms, and burning cities to the ground was a massive shot in the foot. It's expensive, exhausting, and doesn't line anyone's pockets. Instead of destroying only to rebuild on their own dime, Persia had a masterstroke. They outsourced domination. They didn't shove their language down anyone's throat, they didn't wipe out religions, and they absolutely refused to butcher thousand-year-old cultures that were already working just fine. On the contrary, they bankrolled the reconstruction of Jewish temples and left the Egyptian elite sitting comfortably in power. The map of the world was redrawn with a logistical framework and a supposed tolerance so ruthlessly well calculated that it achieved the unthinkable. It turned blood enemies into docile tax collectors, fiercely loyal to a king most of them would never even see in person. And before we dive deep into the guts of this administrative juggernaut, I want to invite you, if you truly value history, to subscribe to the channel and hit that like button. Also, a special favor. Drop your name and age down in the comments. I read every single message, and I love knowing who the seasoned minds are that travel through the past with me. With loyalty bought by stability rather than sheer terror, the empire established itself with overwhelming force. But there was a crucial roadblock on this journey. It does you absolutely no good to dominate continents if an official order takes months to cross the desert and reach your governor. Bureaucratic peace required an ungodly amount of speed to stay on its feet. And that's exactly where they created something that changed the rules of the game forever. That crucial detail I just mentioned, my friends, was exactly the Achilles' heel that brought down so many greedy monarchs in antiquity. The brutal distance and the relentless, unforgiving pace of the ancient world. Think about it. How on earth do you maintain absolute control over a monumental empire? One that swallows up impassable mountain ranges, scorching deserts, and wild rivers, where the mere rumor of an armed uprising in a far-flung province could easily take 3 to 4 months just to reach your ears in the capital? By the time the royal cavalry laced up their boots, saddled their horses, and crossed the entire map to put out the fire, the rogue governor would have already crowned himself, consolidated his own army, and the king would literally be left holding the bag. The ancient world was vast, rugged, and dangerously slow. While the biggest and most feared armies of that era, with their heavy war chariots and infantry weighed down by bronze shields, could sweat their way through maybe 10 miles a day, fighting the jagged terrain and the brutal weather more than actual flesh and blood enemies, Persian intelligence understood that time was the most valuable and treacherous gear in the engine of war. They absolutely could not afford the luxury of being slow. And it was with this cold, pragmatic mindset that they didn't just build an empire. They engineered a literal circulatory system across the earth, breathing life into what would be immortalized in the history books as the legendary Royal Road. And don't go thinking this was just some dirt trail for trade mules to haul sacks of grain. We are talking about an artery of solid stone, meticulously calculated by top-tier engineers, stretching for nearly 1,800 miles and tearing through the empire from end to end without asking anyone for permission. The real genius of the Persian administration, however, wasn't just paving a colossal highway. After all, building straight roads was something Roman engineers would do with tremendous mastery much later on. The true, undeniable masterstroke was the brilliant operating system they installed right on top of this formidable expressway. The Persian High Command knew perfectly well that the human body and the brute force of animals have a hard physical limit, an inescapable breaking point where hunger and exhaustion turn the best, most highly trained troops into easy pickings for raiders or rebels. To solve this intricate logistical puzzle, every 18 miles, which happens to be the exact maximum distance a good horse can run at a full gallop before losing its breath and needing to recover, they built heavily fortified relay stations. These were authentic, high-security government outposts operating non-stop, 24 hours a day, whether under torrential spring downpours or the punishing, relentless desert sun. At these strategic checkpoints, there were always fresh, top-breed horses, plenty of excellent food, and a wide-awake messenger on absolute standby, ready to grab the leather saddlebag of imperial documents and hit the road that very second. In practical military and diplomatic terms, this meant that a summary execution order, the deployment of an entire troop, or a simple administrative decree dictated by the king in the comfort of his palace, could cross the belly of the ancient world and reach its final destination in an unbelievable 7 days. We are talking about a shattering of physical and temporal limits so absurd, so far ahead of its time, that mankind would only manage to match this logistical feat thousands of years later with the invention of the telegraph in the modern era. To rival empires who still relied on runners on foot, trekking through dense thickets and muddy backroads just to deliver a message that arrived old and useless, the speed of the Persian reaction looked like straight-up witchcraft, something completely detached from reality. The enemy hadn't even finished sharpening their swords to plan a sneak attack, and the Persian imperial battalions were already knocking on the door to collect the debt with heavy interest. This record-breaking expansion and control wasn't magic or luck. It was logistics in its purest, most overwhelming form, rendering physical space completely irrelevant. But there was a very important gear in this machine of domination. Having the fastest highway in the world perfectly solved the issue of communication and troop movement. But gigantic empires cost absolute fortunes to keep from collapsing. To guarantee that no one would dare bite the hand that fed them and to keep loyalty strictly intact, Persian financial intelligence pulled an even quieter, more civilized, and utterly devastating weapon out of their sleeve, one forged in pure gold. This silent weapon forged in pure gold, which I mentioned a moment ago, solved the biggest, most agonizing puzzle for any conquering monarch of that era once and for all. Look at it this way. Taking over a territory through brute force, tearing down the local ruler and raising your own flag is, incredibly enough, the easiest part of a war. The real, exhausting logistical nightmare begins the very next day, when you have to keep that new province under absolute lockdown without draining the state's coffers dry and without wearing out your own army. Before this stroke of Persian administrative genius truly hit the stage, trade in the vast ancient world was a massive headache, It was a complete mess based on the archaic law of barter or on irregular chunks of precious metals with no standard value whatsoever. Just imagine the daily chaos, the dragging slowness, and the endless room for fraud when a merchant from Babylon tried to negotiate dozens of sacks of wheat with a craftsman all the way down in Egypt, each of them using a different weight of silver or copper that had to be meticulously weighed and tested for every single miserable transaction. It was a scenario that choked development, bred deep mistrust, and kept monumental wealth from ever being generated. It was exactly to stop this massive bleeding of time and trust that the Persian Empire introduced a game-changer that shook the very foundations of the global economy of that age. A standard trading weight, stamped and fully guaranteed by the state itself. They put into circulation the infamous gold derrick. Do not think of this as just some shiny piece of metal meant for flexing. It was an unquestionable statement of sheer power and stability, minted with an insanely rigorous standard of purity for the time, hitting right around the 95% mark of solid gold. For the first time in the turbulent history of mankind, the heavy, rusted gears of international trade began to spin smoothly, rapidly, and securely. An isolated tribe way out on the fringes of the map, right near the border with India, could now conduct precise, fair, and direct transactions with a wealthy merchant set up on the distant shores of the Aegean Sea, knowing full well that the coin held the exact same value in any corner of those three continents. However, when the empire standardized the economy beneath this mighty golden umbrella, they did something far smarter and much deeper than simply making life easier for busy merchants. Without firing a single arrow, Persia made the very idea of an armed rebellion completely, financially unsustainable. Try to put yourself in the shoes of a local leader, a governor who has just been assimilated. If you decide to spearhead an armed revolt against the Persian king, the empire's first form of retaliation won't just be sending an army marching down the royal road. They will completely cut your province off from the global trade network. Your hard-earned gold derricks would instantly lose their imperial backing, commerce would dry up overnight, and your economy would crumble like a fragile house of cards. Taking on the Persians, or even attempting to kick them out of your lands, meant, in cold, hard reality, completely nuking your own nation's bank account. It would utterly ruin the local elite, who were already getting filthy rich at a staggering pace, all thanks to the peace guaranteed by the empire. At the end of the day, monetary standardization proved to be the deadliest, most efficient, and quietest soldier ever deployed on a battlefield. This army of gold didn't require rations, didn't need to rest at the outposts on the royal road, and kept enemy generals on a brutally tight leash with nothing more than the clinking of coins at the bottom of the treasury. Nobody burns their own money, right? And that is how, by hitting their adversaries right in the wallet, the Persian war machine bought the peace and the irreversible submission of dozens of nations. But no matter how much gold kept the economy running without friction, and no matter how brilliantly those roads made the world smaller, there was still one crucial piece missing on this imperial chessboard. After all, how do you guarantee that all this mountain of money, combined with almost unrestricted local power, doesn't go straight to the heads of the administrators in these far-flung provinces? Money bought compliance, but there was a highly dangerous loophole that Persian intelligence had to close to avoid imploding from the inside out. That dangerous detail, which definitely kept any military strategist of the time up at night, came down to a purely human and relentlessly mathematical limitation. A single king, no matter how sharp, powerful, and divinely feared he might be, simply does not have enough eyes in his head to watch over 3 continents all at once. It doesn't matter if you have the most disciplined army on earth and the most well-oiled economy pumping through the veins of the royal road. If your government machine relies on your physical presence to put out every little fire that pops up on the horizon, you're doomed. The empire had become way too colossal, boasting cultures that were too complex and populations that were way too massive to be micromanaged from a single throne room without the whole thing collapsing under the sheer weight of its own bureaucracy. The ultimate fix, rolled out by Darius the Great, was a stroke of public administration genius that today we might very well call the algorithm of the satrapies. Instead of trying to wrap his arms around the whole world and inevitably failing miserably, Darius took that massive, chaotic stretch of land, spanning all the way from Egypt to the mountains of India, and surgically sliced it up into 20 highly organized fiscal provinces. But the true masterstroke of this setup wasn't just drawing lines and carving up dirt on a papyrus map. The real game-changer was handpicking exactly who got to sit in the big chair and run the show in those territories. Instead of making the classic mistake of shipping out heavy-handed, unknown Persian generals to step on the necks of the newly conquered locals, a move that breeds instant hatred and resentment, the Imperial High Command went with a much more sophisticated playbook. They handed the actual keys to the kingdom over to the local elites themselves, the nobles and regional leaders who were granted the prestigious title of satraps. Just picture the emotional intelligence and the cold, tactical brilliance of this move. The guy who was your sworn mortal enemy just yesterday, the one who could easily use his massive influence to spark a bloody peasant revolt, was now completely absorbed into the system. He was handed a highly prestigious gig, backed by a life of absolute luxury, funded by the imperial treasury, and given the unquestionable power to rule and judge his own people in the name of the great, distant king. And in return for all this pomp, glory, and local autonomy, the central government, sitting pretty in the lavish capital of Susa, demanded just one thing: the blind, uncompromising fulfillment of two exact metrics. There was zero room for negotiation, no middle ground, and absolutely no lame excuses. Rule number one was crystal clear: the taxes, rigorously calculated and paid out in those shiny gold derricks, had to be collected and shipped on the exact due date, without a single ounce of wealth missing. The second demand was strictly military. The annual quota of strong, well-fed soldiers required to fill out the ranks of the imperial army had to be met and kept on constant standby, just waiting for the green light to march. As long as they played ball with those two basic ground rules, the satrap and his people were totally free to go about their daily lives and keep their traditions as if nothing had ever changed. It's right here that we need to bust a highly romanticized historical myth. This famous, highly praised Persian tolerance never stemmed from some divine empathy, a modern sense of human rights, or the bleeding heart of a pacifist monarch. It was, pure and simple, a brilliant, utilitarian, and ice-cold calculation of risk. The Persian bureaucratic machine completely understood that a population given total freedom to worship in the temples of their ancestors, provided with safe roads and standardized money to get rich through trade, and who still saw their own countrymen running the neighborhood, simply has zero logical or emotional reason to waste their precious energy secretly forging swords in the dead of winter. Rebellion becomes terrible for business, an unnecessary headache that wrecks everyone's livelihood and puts family stability on the line. They figured out, with terrifying clarity, that carefully dosed autonomy is the strongest padlock ever made. It builds the perfect socio-political prison, where the inmates don't even realize there are massive iron bars all around them. The illusion of freedom was the invisible mortar keeping wildly different bricks perfectly locked together in the same colossal structure. The problem is, as any seasoned businessman or veteran ruler knows all too well, A system built entirely on handing out massive amounts of power, money, and influence to third parties is a ticking time bomb. It carries the constant, looming threat of human betrayal. If you hand absolute power, untold riches, and a full military infrastructure over to a local governor, what is actually stopping him from using that exact same setup to fund his own private army of mercenaries and taking a shot at the empire? Human beings are corruptible, and Persia knew that better than anyone on Earth. And it was precisely to armor plate this critical vulnerability, to weld shut absolutely every single emergency exit, that Imperial intelligence had to activate a security measure that still sends shivers down the spine today. That dangerous loophole, the one that undoubtedly kept the greatest strategists of the era tossing and turning at night, was rooted in the pure, volatile nature of mankind when faced with the sheer temptation of absolute power. Look at it objectively. If you hand off massive authority, give away the keys to rivers of gold, and leave a sprawling military infrastructure in the hands of local governors scattered across the far edges of 3 continents, what really stops that administrator from weaponizing that very wealth to forge an army of mercenaries and stab the empire in the back? The undeniable fact is that a system brilliantly constructed on the delegation of power carries, at its very core, the imminent and devastating risk of treason. And it was exactly to bulletproof this colossal structure against the unchecked greed of their own satraps that Persian imperial intelligence had to pull the trigger on a genuinely dark surveillance mechanism. They set up a complex, ruthless network that became terrifyingly known to all as the eyes and ears of the king. But don't fool yourself into picturing a conventional riot squad loudly marching down the streets with spears drawn to bully the locals. In reality, this was a highly select group of relentless tax inspectors who operated silently as the very first state-run, secret intelligence agency in the ancient world. And this completely flips the script on what we know about running an empire. These men weren't bouncers looking to crack skulls. They were ice-cold auditors with analytical minds, and because of that, they were extremely dangerous figures. They traveled from province to province using the relay outposts on the Royal Road, always flanked by invisible bodyguards. We're talking heavily armed elite soldiers who blended seamlessly into the crowd in plain clothes, ready to strike with lethal force at the slightest hint of a threat. When these inspectors showed up unannounced in a city, they didn't demand public bowing and scraping. They just demanded to sit down and meticulously cross-reference every single line of the accounting ledgers. With terrifying precision, they dove deep into the papyrus scrolls and clay tablets, not only double-checking the exact math of the taxes, but silently testing the unbreakable loyalty of each governor to the crown. The catch was, nobody ever knew when they were going to show up, what route they'd take, or even worse, who inside the governor's own inner circle might be secretly on the payroll as an undercover informant. The central government didn't need to waste its breath or energy executing rebels in the public square just to flex its authority. The sheer, paralyzing psychological terror of imperial omnipresence, the creeping suspicion that the walls quite literally had ears, did all the dirty work for them. Paranoia hijacked the minds of the local rulers, keeping millions of individuals locked in a terrifying state of submission, where the constant, gnawing uncertainty of being watched was the heaviest chain a man could carry. However, no matter how advanced the espionage and the bureaucracy were, there are times when backroom diplomacy just doesn't cut it. When intelligence failed in the face of imminent chaos, Persia had to prove that its math of terror went way beyond mere bookkeeping. And that was the exact moment they unleashed the most deeply disturbing military illusion ever deployed on a battlefield. No matter how brilliant that machine of fiscal espionage and the economic stranglehold exerted by that ocean of gold truly was, there were unavoidable moments when back-channel diplomacy and silent intimidation smashed right into peoples who were simply too stubborn to bend the knee in peace. When the bureaucracy of the satraps and the undeniable heavy-hitting power of cold, hard cash failed miserably to crush a full-scale rebellion, the Persian imperial war machine cranked up a completely different kind of math. And we're not talking about crunching numbers on a tax ledger anymore. We're talking about the raw, unforgiving math of terror on the battlefield. It was at this exact tipping point that the ancient world came face to face with a combat force so bizarre, so meticulously engineered, that it seemed to defy human biology and the brutal logic of conventional warfare. Persia's highly feared elite shock troops didn't operate on the lazy, old-school strategy of just throwing the biggest mob of guys with swords onto a field and hoping for the best. They operated on an absolute, cold, and unchangeable numerical concept. The unit was made up of exactly 10,000 men. Not a single soldier more, not a single soldier less. The dark genius behind this military outfit wasn't just in the high-end quality of their gear, but in the completely surreal way they behaved when the slaughter started. In traditional warfare back then, as savage blows were traded and the bloody dust kicked up, the front lines would naturally start to thin out. Shields would shatter, sheer exhaustion would tear massive holes in the defensive formation, and that gave the enemy the chance to actually see their own progress through the body count they were racking up. But the blueprint of this Persian Guard flipped the rules of the game on its head. They utilized a terrifyingly synchronized logistical reserve unit in the back. If, right in the middle of that hellish chaos of spears and arrows blocking out the sun, a frontline soldier took a fatal hit and dropped dead, or even if he just got violently ill during a forced march, he was dragged to the back in a matter of milliseconds, almost in the blink of an eye, without breaking a single beat of cadence or pausing for breath. A completely fresh, practically identical warrior would step right out of the shadows of the rear guard to perfectly fill that empty slot. There were absolutely no gaps, no desperate screams for a retreat, and they did not give up a single inch of dirt. The real nightmare was for the warriors standing on the other side of the battlefield. Looking through the cracks of their own battered shields, the scene was straight-up bone-chilling. The macabre design of this tactic created the deeply disturbing illusion that the enemy's front line never, ever shrank, never showed a single weak spot in its formation, and, most terrifyingly of all, never seemed to actually bleed. No matter how fiercely the opponents fought, fighting tooth and nail until their muscles burned out from total exhaustion, dropping soldier after soldier, that living wall standing right in front of them remained perfectly intact and completely unbreakable. For the guys taking the beating, the agonizing feeling was that the dead Persian warriors were somehow, inexplicably, getting right back up from the bloody dirt to keep coming for their lives. And it was exactly because of this terrifying visual trick that they earned their legendary nickname in the history books, the Immortals. This whole military engineering setup wasn't just some cheap parlor trick to keep a shield wall tight. At its darkest core, it was a colossal psychological weapon. It was custom-tailored by the generals to completely break the opponent's mind and grind down their will to fight before a single bone was broken in combat. Just locking eyes with that formidable sea of 10,000 death-proof shields made the adversary realize, with absolute crushing despair, that stepping up to the Persian Empire was not a fair fight against normal men of flesh and bone. Facing the wrath of the king was like trying to bare-knuckle box the very concept of infinity itself. It was absolute hopelessness materialized as a human meat grinder, shredding the sanity of rival empires using nothing but the cold, relentless replacement of parts. And this completely changes what we know about the end of that era. paving the exact road to the climax of this monumental project of global power and administration. And so, when we put all these overwhelming pieces together, the mind-bending speed of the royal road, the iron-fisted control of the gold derrick, the paranoid surveillance of the king's spies, and the manufactured immortality of his shock troops, we realize that the ending to this story was already written long before the first swords ever crossed. It becomes scandalously clear that humanity's first truly global empire wasn't just slapped together by a bunch of bloodthirsty generals. The Persian takeover, swallowing up 3 continents in a record time that flat-out defies logic, was the masterful triumph of a top-tier socio-political engineering project. They took the old playbook of ancient warfare, ripped it right down the middle, and completely rewrote the rules of the game. Their true genius was turning a military invasion into cutting-edge public administration, swapping out chaotic bloodshed for flawless logistics, and trading traditional slavery for an economic integration that was simply too good to refuse. They left everyone with their pockets stuffed full of standardized coins, but hopelessly chained to an invisible leash. During those short 11 years, while the rest of the world was still desperately trying to figure out where all this unstoppable power was coming from, mankind had already been completely backed into a corner. Not by your standard military sieges, but by paved stone roads cutting across deserts and tax ledgers that didn't forgive a single red cent. The strategy worked with such terrifying perfection that by the time those nations finally woke up and realized they weren't the masters of their own destiny anymore, the damage was completely irreversible. The gears of that colossal machine, heavily greased with calculated tolerance and shining gold, were already spinning way too fast to ever be stopped. The story of Cyrus's war machine teaches us that the hardest chains to break aren't the iron ones bolted to a dungeon wall, but the ones the prisoners themselves help polish, truly believing them to be ornaments of freedom. If you carry your own life experiences and truly value real history, and you've made it to the end of this documentary with me, I genuinely ask that you hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. Share this video with your friends and family who also love to understand exactly how our world was shaped. And if you still haven't dropped your name and age in the comments, do it right now. Our community is built by experienced minds just like yours, and I make it an absolute point to read every single story. Thank you so much for the incredibly valuable company, and I'll see you on our next journey into the past.